All right. So thank you all for joining me and John today for Coffee with Katie. I'm really excited to have John here. He's such a true cooperator, and he's working on a new project that I'm really excited about and excited for him to talk to you about. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time today. We want to give all of our time to John, but he's going to lead us through some conversation, and then we'll have a chance for questions, right, John,
Mhm.
through the conversation. Okay, and then we'll wrap up. So thank you all for being here, and John, it's all yours.
Thanks, Katie. And yeah, I just want to acknowledge how cool it is with what you do and how you do these monthly sessions. This will be my second time now participating. And yeah, I'm just always pleased to know that these are happening, even if I'm not coming to them. And so it's nice to be a part of this one too and see quite a few familiar faces. And I know I won't get a chance to meet all of you who I haven't met, but there was this idea as far as doing a little round of introductions, rather than all of us do it together, because at first I thought there'd be like 25 plus people. But even with this number of people, I think we're going to try something out here where we're going to go into a breakout room, which is something I like to do. It's something that I find helps condense periods of time where we all want to engage and we don't have the time to all do it at once on one big screen. But I'm going to give a little bit of a task. So this is before I kind of introduce what we're doing. So the task within this check-in is to talk about what it is that compelled you to come to this session. So you'll get into a breakout room. There's going to be 3 people in each room, and you're going to share with one another what it is that compelled you to come to this session. And if you can, speak about it within the context of your work within your co-op and all the work you've been doing within your co-op. What is it that compelled you to this topic? Hopefully you know what the topic is. And if you don't, within your trio, it'll likely come forward. So Katie's going to throw us into these breakout rooms, and we'll do that for about 5 minutes. So try to do the math as to how much time each of you are going to take. So it's a quick check-in, and then we'll come back into the room.
Okay, we ready?
Hang on.
All right, here we go. I guess it's me and you, Buck. Right.
Well, it looks like we'll probably have to wait about 40 seconds for everyone to show up. And maybe just as we're waiting for everyone to arrive back in this room, one of the questions I'm going to put out is to share what themes might have emerged in your exploration of what compelled you to come here, if there were any themes.
Here comes everyone.
All right. So that's all of, oh, almost all of
We
us.
had two extras join in the
Okay.
interim, so
Okay, well, so yeah, if you're just joining, we were just in breakout rooms. It was just a way to check in and introduce one another, and to also explore the question as to what it was that compelled you to come specifically to this topic. And I sort of acknowledged as well that maybe not all of you are really familiar with what the topic is of the session, but I'm sure there's enough of you who are familiar that we now sort of have a sense as to what the topic is. But I wanted just to give an opportunity too here for anyone to share like what themes might have come up in your trio, or if you're in a 2-person or 4-person breakout room. Were there any themes that came up as far as what compelled you to come to this session?
I could start. Hello from the Bethlehem Food Co-op, and our breakout room was the 3 people from the Bethlehem Food Co-op.
No way. How does that happen?
So we thought you did it on purpose, just so
No,
we
I
could say
didn't.
hi.
No, I did. I random assigned it. Oh,
Oh, that's
funny.
really interesting. Okay, so
Yeah.
anyway, we all admitted that we didn't even know what the topic was. We were only here because we're big fans of John Steinman and Katie. So then we did look up the title. And for us, we're really just here to listen and learn to know how other co-ops, both startups and open stores, because we're straddling both of those, are getting their members engaged in the decision-making in their own co-ops. So, so for my partners, did I capture that correctly?
So I'll capture that as curiosity on how to engage member owners, among other things. And anyone else want to share any reports from your breakout room? Any themes? And if no themes, anything that just stood out as far as what compelled everyone to be here?
Have really any themes, but we went into dialogue right away. But we did talk a little bit about how to keep dialogue going between owners and board. A little bit about that, and then we talked more into just the appreciation of the cooperative principles and appreciation for both you, John, and you, Katie. So, yeah.
Thanks, Becky.
And I got some really good information from Muck that I'm going to follow up on with him. And that's what I love about these things, right? We're all kind of like little sponges.
Hi, I'll go. Sorry, I don't have video today, but I'm from the Westchester Co-op, and we were fortunate enough to have John speak to our group last year. We're like 7 years in, and we're still gathering members, and we're still looking for property. But you know, one of the biggest questions or issues we always have is how to engage membership. And I hope to get some ideas and insights from this wonderful group. So again, wanted to hear what others have to say. And John and Katie, nice to see you on the video as well.
Thanks, Nellie. Anyone else?
Our group talked about communication. So we talked about Slack. One of the things that our Whitewater, Wisconsin, by the way, what we did is we sent a message out to all of our board members. We have 9, and asked them for first, second, and third option. How do they want to be contacted? Text, Slack, email. And it seems to work well because a lot of people want to be texted. So, hey, if they don't open Slack, why would we use Slack? You know, so that was one of the things that Whitewater does.
Thanks, Ron. I'm going to jump on that and just use it as a segue into kind of continuing into the session, because I think what Ron you're describing is a really important aspect of the type of dialogue that I'm starting to work with and that I want to share a little bit about with you today. And it's this being able to bring awareness to how we communicate. So rather than just move into what might feel like just this is the way, this is the assumption of how we communicate. We use email, we have our meetings, we, for example, text with each other. There's all different orientations that we have towards how we communicate. And then once we bring that sort of awareness where we ask, which is the method that we want to use, we start to bring awareness to how we communicate. So I wanted to share what is it I hope you leave with out of this session. And I jotted down three things. So the first that I'm hoping you're going to leave with out of this session is an expanded consideration of what's possible in group communication. The next is to consider how to foster a dialogic culture. So that's a term that's an interesting one that I'll speak to later. So to consider how to foster a dialogic culture in your co-op. And by that, I know it sounds like there's a focus that's a bit more on how to engage member owners, and that's part of it. But of course, with a co-op, there's also communication that's happening at the board level. Eventually, it'll be with your general manager. And beyond that, there'll be the culture of communication within the co-op, among the management, among the staff, between management and staff. And so there's, various subgroups within the co-op. Consider the cooperative dialogue workshops that I'll be scheduling soon. So that's the third. So this is very much an introduction into a new area of work that I'm starting to cultivate. And then it's possible that this session will kickstart your own personal journey into, and here's another big word, metacognition. So being aware of our thought processes. So this approach to dialogue has done that for me. It might do that for you just in this 1 hour session. And to begin, I guess, an exercise around metacognition, I want to put up something on my screen here. So this is don't try to understand how this has to do with co-ops. This is an exercise in expanding the frontiers of our thinking. Just give me a second here. Can everyone see this?
Yep, we can.
Just take a moment to look at this map.
And John, I think we're seeing your view.
Oh, you're seeing my view?
Yeah.
How about now?
There we go. We got it.
Great. And if your mic is on, and if it's not, you can turn it on. And anyone just want to share what it is you're feeling, not so much thinking, but what is it you're feeling as you look at this map?
The world upside down.
Yes.
And how does that make you feel?
Insecure.
I heard insecure.
Yes.
Okay.
Upside down.
Makes you feel upside down.
Makes me feel upside down. Wow.
Dizzy.
Different perspective on the size of everything, just everything. It makes you think about it more. Like how big are all these countries? And I didn't really think the United States seemed that small compared to
Canada.
I know it's distorted because it's flattened. But
All the names are right side up though, you guys.
yeah.
Yeah,
Right? That's confusing for me.
exactly.
It's
And
colorful.
anyone-
I like it.
Yep.
Wow, that took time to create, John.
Well, it's not my creation, but thanks for thinking I might have created it. And what about, so, we've shared a little bit about how everyone's feeling. What about what it starts to develop in your thinking process of considering the implications of this?
Population, for one thing, where the largest populations are.
Okay.
It brings to me the book, Drawing on the Right Side of Your Brain, where in the beginning you draw upside down. And it's a way of seeing differently.
I start thinking about how to fix it.
When I was in undergrad, we had one class, it was an environmental class, and the final question was, what are the implications of the United States if we were to have been settled west to east instead of east to west. And that's what this reminds me of. It's like you would have to rethink everything.
Well, here's another one to look at in that context.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me think about climate. Which foods grow where and why? Where is it warm? Where is it cool? What if it was different?
Mm-hmm. So one thing that gets explored with these upside down maps, so I'm not the first person to do this. This is there's an exploration of this out in the world that is used around exploring cultural bias as well as media bias. And it starts to unpack the ways and the impacts that this can have on how we think, how we see the world, how we see other people in the world. And there's, no distinct origin story as to how this all happened, but there are certain moments in time, where decisions were made as to how these maps would be designed. It was also alluded to the taking of a sphere and making it flat, of course, distorted the map, which I'll get to in just a moment. But one of the more dominant aspects of the discourse around this is that it's very Eurocentric. Europe is in the middle. And so a lot of the maps we use today can trace their histories back to Europe and mostly the 16th century. Whereas this map, which I showed earlier, Europe is not so central. And then the other piece that's important here that came up was that the maps we see went from being a sphere to being flat. And in order to ensure accurate navigation nautically across the oceans, back in the 16th century, this projection was created on how to take a sphere and put it on a flat map, which distorted everything above the equator and below the equator. The furthest away you got from the equator, the more distorted the sizes were. So someone mentioned Canada. So I took Canada, which is where I am right now, where I live, and I dragged it over Africa because that's the actual size of how Canada would look if it was above Africa or beside it. And this is an interesting one that shows the exact dimensions of each country relative to each other if we were to actually see them for the sizes that they are. So top to bottom on the mainland of Canada, it's the same distance as the US. So, it was kind of alluded to that this exercise, for one thing, is an example of the type of exercises I do in my work with dialogue. It's not just about having a way to speak with each other in a group. It's also about creating exercises where we expand the frontiers of our thinking and start to, in a way, almost retrain our brains and our perspective and our perceptions. And so, someone said this is a great exercise to see something from a different perspective. There's discomfort often that can accompany seeing things from a different perspective, which I'd like to think is one of the reasons why so much of our communication can become so fragmented and incoherent and challenging, is being able to see things from other perspectives that someone might be bringing into the room. But this also helps describe some of the collective assumptions that a group might have going into communication. So this helps to describe collective assumptions and how those assumptions influence the world. And so, there's quite a lot of dialogue around how has this more Eurocentric way of seeing the world informed this idea that whatever's on top is better than what's on the bottom. Generally, what's on top is where the more dominant white countries are. How has this informed bias in how we see the world? How has this perpetuated systemic colonialism? And then the one that I think is the easiest to sort of understand as far as how we see the world is this idea that Australia is down under. So all this time we've referred to Australia as down under, and it was back in the 70s where this upside down map became most popular because it was someone from Australia who wanted to challenge this notion that Australia is down under. And so how has this idea of being down under shaped the way the world sees Australia, for example. Because oftentimes, within the structures of our organizations and how we see the world, what's above is usually considered to be better, what's below is less than. And so how does all this inform how we think and see? So this is just a little exercise to explore the frontiers of our thinking. And so this introduces, where dialogue comes in to the picture, because it's an opportunity for us to help practice that. And so the work of dialogue that I have been studying and now work with helps uncover hidden values that control behavior. So that might be our worldviews, the cultural paradigms we come from, any racial and gender bias, any religious and political beliefs. There are hidden values that control how we think, how we see the world. And dialogue also reveals undiscussed thinking. Does anyone want to take a guess at what that means?
I'll take a stab.
Sure.
Undiscussed dialogue reveals undiscussed thinking. The first thing that comes to mind is when we get triggered, when somebody says something, and for some reason it triggers you. If you don't know why, but it triggers you.
Yep. Thanks, Paula. So that would be one example. Another is oftentimes there are things that we are thinking, or a subgroup within a larger organization is thinking, but that hasn't come out into the collective. So there's all the thinking we do in between our board meetings and our startup co-ops, for example. Not all of that gets discussed. And so this is a space where some of what's happening in between the moments of communication gets to be revealed. We get to bring that forward. And so I'm using this word dialogue, and I think it's important to identify that oftentimes we use the word discussion and dialogue synonymously, as if they're the same thing. So I often will hear someone refer to any type of communication with a group or between two people as either a discussion or a dialogue, but there's no distinction as to is there a difference? And in the work that I do with dialogue, there is a distinct difference. And I just want to share a few examples here. So discussion involves individuals thinking alone together. Dialogue involves thinking together. Discussion seeks closure. Dialogue is an unfolding of the context or field in which a problem, question, or curiosity arises. Discussion involves individuals trying to win, to make one's idea prevail. In dialogue, no one is trying to win. There's no pressure to agree or disagree. So these are very distinct experiences. And I would invite anyone, and just make sure your mic's on, to share when you see this, what is it you feel? Or what arises when you're reading these distinctions?
I guess I would say that 90% of the time it feels like we're all involved in discussions and not dialogue. But I think that's kind of the way that we almost the way we've learned to evolve is through discussion versus dialogue. It's maybe it's I don't know. I almost want to say it's easier. Dialogue takes more concentration about what you're saying, what you're speaking about.
Thanks for that reflection, Tracy.
I'd like to add.
I was going to say, going back to your comment about a Eurocentric viewpoint, when I started working over in one of our Native communities that's sitting just 17 miles away from where I'm sitting right now is the border of a reservation. This is all Ojibwe country where I'm at. And when started having conversations that's when you really see the differences in how people are together in these kinds of conversations. And so you could really see the difference between a more Euro-based business, Euro-based discussion model and a more dialogue model that seeks to have everybody's viewpoints brought out and to really have this communal thinking that you were referring to.
Thanks, Becky.
I'd like to add that I think most of the time we have discussions, and when we do have a dialogue and everybody's contributing, it touches my emotions. Like I really feel, it feels so good having everybody contribute. And so, yeah, we need to work on having more dialogue and less discussion.
Dialogue maybe is less judgmental or non-judgmental.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It feels like the priority is on discussion because that's more action or goal oriented. And we're all just trying to get things checked off the list. Like, let's get on the table, let's discuss it, let's make a decision and move on. And dialogue takes an investment of time and energy and emotion, as someone else mentioned.
Yeah, thanks for all that great input, and I want to add to that by, noting that this isn't an effort to say one is better than the other, by showing this comparison. In fact, it's expanding the field of possibility for how we can communicate at different times for different purposes. And so, my experience with dialogue is it can be used to be making decisions. You can use it for making decisions. In fact, it's a really great tool for that. It's also a great tool to help support the process of making decisions in other formats. So for example, if you're using online formats, if you're using more of a standard meeting culture, having dialogue attached to that process just supports the other modes of communication that might be used within an organization. But so this is an important one because for me, I'm always now, when I use these two words, discussion and dialogue, I'm trying to get clear on which is it that I'm speaking to. So I just want to quickly share the origin story for me of where this came from. And I'll make this quick because I want to get to some of the more meat of it. But this is where I live. I'm right now in one of these buildings speaking to you, which is my home. And this is a co-housing community that I helped co-develop about 10, well, we moved in about 10 years ago now. 68 people, 24 homes, a shared common house in the middle. And what's unique about this model is that we manage this community on our own. So we don't hire a project management company to do it for us. We are living with each other or living beside each other, as well as working with each other to manage this space. And it's not easy. Anytime I mention to people that I helped co-develop an intentional community or I live in an intentional community, very often there's this response of, oh yeah, really? How's that going? Almost this expectation that it must be challenging. And it has its incredible moments of bliss and joy. And also it has become one of the most incredible opportunities for personal growth for me and for, I know, a lot of people. For those reasons, for those same reasons that there's resistance to this model, there's also a whole lot of people that really want to dive into that work, the challenge. And, here's just some shots of the people. We share meals with each other, which are optional. No cars come up to the houses. So we have a parking lot. Everyone walks to the house. It's part of the intentional design. So I'm just going to stop my screen sharing. So that's the context for how I got into this work, because one of the things that emerged over many years of being in this community and working with each other was it started to feel to me that there was a mode of communication that was missing. Most of our communication was happening through a more standard meeting structure. We would have monthly meetings where there'd be a speakers list and people would contribute one by one to a topic. We would use, and still do, online input documents to give feedback to a group. Surveys are used, email, Slack, there's all these different modes of communication that are being used. And when I wrote my book, so this is actually a connection to maybe when I met some of you, all those months on the road, traveling from co-op to co-op, gave me an opportunity to really reflect on the ways in which we communicate, and that it seemed to me that there was something missing, which was just described in this previous moment, where you were all describing what you were feeling around reading this difference between dialogue and discussion. That's what I started to feel before arriving at this approach to dialogue, which is quite ancient, which I think was alluded to. You know, there are these ways in which other communities, like Indigenous communities, Quaker communities, use very similar approaches to communication as the basis for how they communicate. For me, I came across the work of David Bohm, who was a theoretical physicist who passed in 1992. And in his final years, in the late 80s, early 90s, he started articulating a different way of communicating with each other based on all of what he saw as to what influences matter, all the unseen spaces that influence matter. He started attaching that to how we communicate, and he started to see that a lot of the fragmentation in the world and the challenge in the world all comes back to how we communicate with each other, and that part of communicating more in a healthier way with each other involves becoming more aware of what's informing our thinking. And so this is, where this origin of dialogue began. I found a book that sort of introduced me to it. And from there, I began studying how to work with this model. And I'm now a member of what's called the Academy of Professional Dialogue. I became accredited last year. And I'm now imagining and starting to bring it into the co-op space, which I'm going to just speak to as well, which is why I see this as an important tool for working within co-ops. I do want to speak to just one of the aspects that I was noticing in our community. You know, we would get together, and this still happens, we get together and have our meetings and have our conversations. And there's an analogy that David Bohm uses, which is this polluted river analogy, which is we're in the river having our conversation, but there's all these undiscussed thinking, all these hidden values upstream that are informing how we think. And they start to color and challenge discourse. So in a discussion, for example, when it feels like things are arriving at an impasse, oftentimes there's something upstream that wants to be explored. And so this is what I was experiencing in our community. And it's not unique to intentional communities. In fact, it's what we find in every organization. Every co-op that I've visited can describe, these circumstances. 2020 came, and that really seemed to amplify this commonality within communication, that there's different values and beliefs that inform where we are and our positions when we're speaking. So I want to share, what happens when we enter into dialogue. So I'll just use some examples from my experience, because this is where my experience with dialogue began, was in my community, which is called Heddlestone Village. And I just want to share, I'll share 3 examples here of the value of dialogue. So one of the first dialogues we had, which was over Zoom, because it was now at this point 2021, we wanted to explore this idea of participation. So participation, as you can imagine, just like with all the work you're doing, in particularly a volunteer organization like a startup food co-op at your stage, participation and the idea of participation and the word participation is really important. In fact, we have a whole agreement that we created, which is one of our policies, which we call agreements, called the Participation Agreement, which spells out how much time we expect one another to engage in the management of our community. So we got into a dialogue like this, and we wanted to explore, what does participation mean? And so, I mentioned earlier that one of the things dialogue does is it reveals hidden values, undiscussed thinking. And the first thing that happened in that moment, as we opened into that question, was this shared understanding among many of us that when we hear that word participation, we feel a sense of guilt. And that had never been explored. So for years, we had been working with this word and using this word. And we all had, not all, but many of us had this experience of feeling guilt with that word. And we started to unpack that. unpacking what is participation. And we got to this place where we realized that all this time we've been using this word participation to describe something else. So one resident, for example, described participation as being just simply walking down the common path in between the houses, that is also participation, not just participating on a committee. And so we realized participation is something a lot bigger than how we defined it. And how we had defined it was really, what are we responsible for? And so instead of this being a participation agreement, this really was a responsibilities agreement. And within just a very short period of time, within an hour and a half in this session together on Zoom, we unpacked this very dominant word that we used in our community and realized there's a whole other relationship that we want to have to it. So this was an example of how we went and met the frontier of our thinking around participation and started to expand our relationship to it. So how would this show up in a co-op? Well, one of the things I hear a lot when I travel around with storefront co-ops are comments like, oh, this doesn't feel like a co-op anymore. So one of the things that happens with a lot of established co-ops is they grow, they evolve, and people start to feel this sense that this is no longer a co-op. So that's an invitation, as I see it, to start to explore, well, what does it mean to be a co-op? What is a co-op? And same thing with the idea of community. You know, that's a word that I'm sure you use quite often, community. What does that actually mean? So I just want to share a slide here of how this looks in practice. What are you? What are you seeing? Yeah, you're seeing this one locus of attention screen.
We see your view again, John,
Okay,
but we do see the locus of attention.
Yeah. So yeah, one of the things that happens within a dialogue is, as a facilitator, for example, I'm paying attention to a few different things. So content is generally where a lot of the focus goes in any dialogue or discussion, communication. We're very focused on content. As a facilitator, facilitating a dialogue with a group, I'm also paying attention to the process. How is it we are speaking with each other? I pay attention to the pace. I pay attention to, as well, the people. So oftentimes, much of the focus goes into the content. We can almost forget that there's people behind the thoughts. And so as a facilitator, I'm also inviting everyone to be aware of the content, the process, and the people. And so, you know, where this connects to co-ops is having had this experience, like I say, of there being what feels like fragmentation within cooperatives of what the member owners want of a co-op, what the board wants, what the staff want. Certainly at your stage, you're not quite at that point yet of having staff who are also part of the cooperative system. And there were some very common themes when I was traveling, going from co-op to co-op, as well, speaking to what you're all interested in, it sounds like, is how to engage member owners. And so members would come to me all the time at my table, selling books, describing to myself how they felt like they had lost connection to their co-op. And so this became this real interest for me to explore, how can we create approaches to communicating with the members, as well as how can members be more involved in the democracy of their co-op. And so this is a big part of what compels me to bring this approach to dialogue into co-ops, is this word that really is so fundamental and foundational to what we are. And I love what this pioneering management theorist said over 100 years ago. Democracy is not a goal, but a path, not attainment, but a process through which people are actively engaged. To have democracy, we must live it day by day. So what this is speaking to is democracy beyond just representation. And so, you know, she was great at really articulating that the institution is not democracy, the people are. So Cooperative dialogue is what I've been translating from the work I've done studying dialogue and bringing it into more of a cooperative context. And it acknowledges that at the core of democracy is how people associate with one another. And so these are two questions that seem to already be active among all of you, as we found out in the opening here. How does your co-op bring attention and intention into how people associate with one another? How does your co-op weave the web of democracy with your members, and eventually for you with management and staff, and also among the board? And why is this so fundamental? All that we do begins with how we communicate. Every action we take, every decision we make, it all begins with communication. So if we don't bring attention to how we communicate, what we do suffers. And so coming back to what Ron was sharing in the beginning, bringing awareness to what are these methods that we're going to use, or I should say modes or mediums of communication, whether it's Slack, text, or email, we start to bring awareness to how we're communicating. And if we don't, then what we do suffers, which might show up as, hey, I thought you would knew about this because, you know, you're supposed to be on Slack, and didn't you see my message on Slack? Well, I'd actually prefer communicating over text. And sure enough, the group decides, you know, we'd rather communicate over text. And this is, you know, what Ron was speaking to. In practice, this is what it looks like. So this was an event that I hosted and facilitated about a month ago now in Port Townsend at the food co-op there. So that's a 1970s era food co-op. And these are mostly members as well as some board directors. And we're exploring this question that I mentioned earlier. What might community mean to the food co-op today? And it seems like a highly relevant question because, as you all know, what community might have meant to a co-op of the 1970s might be very different to what community means to them today or to your co-ops. Certainly when, you know, I go to the up and coming food co-op conference, I see a very significant difference in the types of communities that are interested in the co-op model. So for a 1970s co-op, this seems like a really important exploration as co-ops continue to evolve and change, which is one of the only constants, change. And what you're seeing here too is what I use as the fishbowl format, which is not required to engage in dialogue. You could easily have one big circle or many concentric circles where everyone's participating. The fishbowl format has its advantages, which I won't get into now just for sake of time. But what's happening here is there's a group of 5 people in the middle who are having the conversation or the dialogue, and everyone on the outside is watching. And if anyone on the outside wants to participate, they come and signal that they'd like to step into what's called the fishbowl in the middle. And one person in the fishbowl has to leave in order for another to come in. And what this helps to bring forward is a practice of listening more intently and more deeply from the outside circle in particular. And it allows for a different perspective too to come from the outside circles. So as a facilitator, I might turn to the outside circle and ask, hey, is there anything you're noticing that's happening within the dialogue that might support the continuing flow of this topic, of this dialogue? And there'll be some input brought into the fishbowl, and then they'll continue the process. And the last slide I'll put up, or I'll put up just 2 more slides and then hopefully just open it up for some final comments here. This is some of what goes into creating the container. So a lot of this is really a recapping of some of what's come up and through some of your comments and some of what I've shared. So some of the guidance in going into a dialogue is that there's no right or wrong. And in the absence of right or wrong, there's an opportunity for curiosity. That's really what opens up. We're not trying to figure anything out. So there's no goal to get to any place. And usually if you decide you're trying to figure something out, you've already created an assumption that what you're trying to figure out is important. Being aware of assumptions. So try to bring awareness to some of the unconscious assumptions that you have or the group has. We're not trying to influence anyone nor the group, so we're not trying to persuade each other. There's an opportunity to pause rather than give people a chance to enter into a monologue. We try to create this container of speak for 2 minutes. And then if you're going beyond 2 minutes, it's probably time to pass it on to someone else. Welcoming silence is a really important part of this, where there's opportunity to process what's being shared. for example. And there's always a reminder that we're practicing a different way of communicating with each other. And then there's always a confidentiality piece attached to that. And this idea of being in a meeting without a purpose can be very uncomfortable for people who want to get into a meeting to figure something out. And yet there is a purpose. And I'll just quickly run through this. This is just some of what comes out of these processes of entering into this space of dialogue. We expand and deepen understanding amongst each other. That feels like a pretty important purpose. We establish shared meaning in groups and across the organization. So I use that example of participation, that word where this new shared meaning of that word starts to unfold. We nurture collaborative relationships within and between groups. We bring attention to not only what's being spoken, but how it's being spoken. We deepen our capacity to listen and be listened to. It reveals a bigger picture of the diversity within the group, accessing a collective wisdom that's far greater than any one individual could hold. Sounds pretty cooperative to me. We reveal undiscussed thinking, we uncover hidden values, and we divert a group's tendency to focus on the parts that comprise a system and towards an expanded field of view that reveals an already present whole. And a big part of what we're doing in dialogue is we're asking questions. And so, I really like this quote: organizations evolve in the direction of the questions they most persistently and passionately ask, especially those big picture questions. So, in many cases, the dialogues can resolve themselves in a way within one session, like I described with the participation example. Other times they evolve over many dialogues. They start to grow and a different pathway starts to emerge as to what we're exploring. And, as you can tell, I love talking about this, and we've got 5 minutes. So I want to just turn it over to any sort of feelings and curiosities, or turn it over to you, Katie, to do whatever you need to do in these last 5 minutes. But I'd love to just hear any curiosities that come out of this.
Yeah, I don't need any time. Let's hear from others.
Sure.
John, I'm wondering how you lure people into devoting time to this very valuable but superficially unproductive activity.
Very, very important question. And it's not easy, to be honest. I mean, it's I've made the efforts, for example, here within my co-housing community, and there's a small subgroup that are very interested and very dedicated and are showing up to most of them. It represents, about, I'd say, a quarter of the residents, voting residents, the adult residents. And it's not easy. And so part of what is the journey, I think, with dialogue is to have a core group of people who are working with it and practicing it and understanding it, and then figuring out how to begin integrating it into already existing processes, where you might begin to start replacing a mode of communication that you're using for something else with something that's more dialogic. And that's the journey I'm on right now. And then that said, there were a whole lot of folks who wanted to show up to that dialogue I showed you the photo of at the Port Townsend Food Co-op. And if you build it, they will come. It worked.
John, I'm curious if you have had any interaction with art of hosting, conversations that matter. It's a worldwide phenomenon. And there's Jerry Nagel here in Minnesota and Kathy Jourdain, who's up in your neck of the woods, Canada, a little bit east of you. Anyway, they do worldview intelligence, and that's what they do for their livelihood. And what Muck was asking about, these conversations are so important. People do take time to have them. And there are different methodologies. You show the fishbowl. We've done several what we call grand gatherings here, where people come together strictly for dialogue. And there seems to be a real hunger for it.
Mhm.
But I was just curious if you had any overlapping with the worldview intelligence and hosting conversations that matter.
Nothing beyond just knowing of its existence.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm aware of it. And but I will just also add that you know, back on is it Buck, your question? Yep. That there is this experience that I would say like almost everyone has, and it's not universal, but most have out of these dialogues this experience of feeling better than they did when they came into it. So it's like I always think of it as like yoga. It's like there's this resistance to go to the class, to your yoga class, but once you go and you come out of it, you're like, wow, why did I even think that I wouldn't go to that? And this is what happens oftentimes is we walk out feeling refreshed and energized. And so I'd like to think that experiences like that are what propel this to keep happening. Mhm. Any other questions or curiosities? This is just scratching the surface of a very big subject that really challenges, you know, some very strong experiences of communication that have been embedded in how we do things.
What was the spelling of the man's name who sort of got you inspired about this? It was.
Yeah, here,
Bohm.
I'll just put it in the chat.
Oh yeah, that'd be great. Bohm. Okay.
And I can follow up too with Katie afterwards with some maybe links to just send out to whoever was signed up on this call, like some of the books I'd recommend. There's the Academy of Professional Dialogue that I'm a part of now. And I also have a little newsletter that I'm sure most of you are on. I'll just put that into the chat here. So yeah, you can sign up to my newsletter if you're not on it, and I'll send out more information about this cooperative dialogue evolution.
Fantastic. That's fantastic. Thank you, John. We're at 1 o'clock, so I will end our session here shortly, but you know, this feels very deep and very powerful and very innovative, I believe. And I think that's how we continue to grow as cooperators, is by innovation and by change and by being brave enough to do things differently. So applaud you, John, for introducing this to the co-op world. Thank you very much. And I look
Katie.
forward to seeing more about how this develops for sure.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll just share as a little closing there, you know, co-ops emerged as countercultural organizations. And over time, from especially the 1970s, they became much more organizational, business-like, right? There were some periods of that happening. And it seems to me that some of maybe what were the more countercultural forms of communication were lost with that, or maybe they were never developed. But it seems to me that, you know, co-ops are in an amazing position to bring in more countercultural forms of communication, because I think it's at the core of what co-ops are. And if we don't, I think that's where we start to feel these tensions between the business and the roots, you know, of the organization.
Absolutely.
So thank you for hosting this, and really nice to see you all and meet you all. And I hope this wasn't too much to process for in 1 hour, but I'd love to hear how this unfolds. So by all means, get in touch with me.
Awesome. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, everyone.
John, I told Paula and Megan that they could stay on here for a second. I need to talk with them about something. So as people are dropping off, you'll notice they'll stay on. Oh, and now you're on mute.
I got all that from you. So yes, we'll connect soon.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good deal. Good deal. Thank you so much, John. Very, very
My pleasure.
powerful.
Yeah, thank you.
That was really great, John.